absolutely wild as Vern Gagne's All-Star Wrestling goes coast to coast and continent to continent. The greatest wrestlers in the world.
He may be an apprentice carpenter, but I guarantee you he is a seasoned ring veteran.
I've been hit with bar stools, bar rags, barmaids.
I'm talking to you.
They're scared that Hulkamania's still running wild. Oh, yeah. I got a big fat wife and 9 kids at home, and I gotta feed them.
And take a look at Jesse the Body in real life.
Open your hand once if you would.
You want to see it?
This is absolutely unbelievable. Totally, completely out of control.
He's coming in over the top. Hey! Look out!
Yeah, that's right, Mick heads. Look out, because we are back for another week. At least one more week. We haven't been canceled yet. They're still they're renewing the contract on a week-to-week basis. My name is Chris Tubbs. I am the number one Mick head. There's Polish Joe. He is he's another Mick head, and the biggest. Well, I guess he's the chief Mick head, the head Mick head, the head Mick head, the Big Stir.
You were going to say the biggest Mick head of them all, weren't you?
I was going to, yes.
Yeah.
If there was one Mick head to rule all Mick heads, Sir Mick head.
You know, I kind of wonder what Stan Hansen's real wife thought when she saw that promo that he's got a wife and 9 kids at home. You know, I mean,
a big fat wife.
A big fat wife. Yeah. I mean, because Stan had what, a couple of kids, you know, and a fairly skinny wife. I mean, what the, oh boy.
She's a tiny little Asian, as he says.
Oh boy, that's great.
Yeah, it sounds like something a Texan would say. I kid.
Here we go. We're ready to go back to the Showboat days.
Yes, every period of wrestling has their era, right? That's kind of the hip new thing. We got to have this era, that era. I called this the Showboat Era, and you guys were both part of it. And there's a reason why we picked it. Well, you picked this one, Mick, and we'll get to it here in a minute. I know that Joe's a little under the weather, so we're going to bulldoze through all of this stuff. Fast forward to the 4-minute and 37-second mark, okay? Coming in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, first of all, for those that want to be a part of the, if you're a Mick head, go to tpublic.com, user Unleash Plus. You can get your Slick Mick. We're going to get some Mick head merchandise. We're going to get some raining in Miami. We got some ideas. Things are hopefully starting to slow down on my end, so I'm hoping that we can put it together. T-shirts. We have phone cases, mouse pads. We have pretty much anything you want. So just go to Unleashed Plus on tpublic.com. As well as we've got a really cool thing. It's called our Patreon. It's our pinfall level, right? It's $4.99 a month. It is super, super easy. All you do is sign up on YouTube. You get the podcast a day early. You get access to our watch-alongs, to our exclusive interviews, to our live chats. It's just a nice little fun little extra ditty that we put out there. And we're not going to tell you when the extra content is available. You're just going to have to find out on your own. And if you have your alerts set up, $4.99 a month, well worth it. You get a letter from me. You get a thank you. You get a magnet, a sticker, and you get a 5-pack of pictures from Mick Karch. So you've got all of that for $4.99 a month. And listen, the more people that we have for Patreon, then the more content that we can put out there. And, now that we're kind of getting into the spring and the summer, things change with our schedules. So hopefully, things will lighten up a little bit. So we will, we'll get that more out in 3, 2, 1, and mark. 4:37 back to programming.
Wow.
10 more seconds. Keep talking.
I had 4:37. Well, son of a bitch. I don't know what I'm going to say.
Now 4:37.
Oh, I had 4:37 on mine. Oh, maybe because I've got that 10-second extra. Well, anyway, you're right. We'll go by yours. Well, I've already screwed that up. Hey, let's get to the Showboat days, guys, because this is one thing I like about this show is that, as I was telling Mick before we started, we can go back to the early days, that some of us just were not able to experience. Joe, you were a kid. Mick, you were, you were in your probably mid 50s. So we're gonna, we go from that, and me. But then we go to the later stages, and unfortunately, not some of the better memories, but they're ones that, for me, being a Gen Xer and younger, these are the ones that we kind of remember. So we can kind of jump all around. But you guys were there during the Showboat era in 1987. So again, I'm going to go ahead and step back. I've got the pictures. You guys just go ahead and tell the stories, because I know you guys were both there. And for some of us, this was really the beginning for me personally, watching the AWA at the Showboat. So I'm going to step back out, and I'll let you guys kind of tell us about the Showboat days, the Showboat era, and was this indeed the beginning of the end?
It's interesting, and I started with the scripting of this show when I started with the AWA. I didn't talk about early 1987, although I looked at the roster, wasn't that much different. But I figured, why not start when I started, which was in August of 1987. And I think, Joe, you and I were there, and I think a case could be made that this was the beginning of the end. It was about a year after Wrestle Rock. You're going into 1988, and you see some of those attendance figures in 1988 just dropped off substantially. But nonetheless, the AWA still had a pretty damn good roster in 1987. Take us back a little bit, Joe, because you were there prior to that. How did the AWA make that move from Atlantic City to the Showboat?
Well, the AWA had been running the Showboat for, should we just say, part of the circuit, doing spot shows. And once the Pro Wrestling USA experiment failed, then it was, well, we got to get away from the Tropicana. Let's go to another gambling city. So Las Vegas was indeed it. The AWA had already been doing shows at the Showboat Hotel. And so it was almost a natural move to go from Atlantic City to the Showboat. Now it wasn't like immediate. It didn't go directly from the Tropicana to the Showboat in Vegas. That took a little bit more time, but it did indeed happen. And as far as this being the beginning of the end, yes. However, I will have to say that in 1987, not only the roster, but everything that the AWA had going, they still had a good following. The Showboat was still selling out. The ESPN Championship Wrestling was still a thing. Vern was still running 20 towns. The boys were still getting a payday, albeit a smaller payday. So 87 also had, if I'm not mistaken, had the Rockers against Rose and Summers. And that generated an incredible run for the AWA.
Yeah, and again, I started with the AWA August 1st of 1987. And my first foray for the AWA was actually a Minneapolis taping. I didn't get out to the Showboat right away. My debut was in Minneapolis. The AWA, I would have to say, Joe, as you look at the Showboat, and we talked about this before, the casino environment, the big city environment, the glitz and the glamour of the AWA. AWA needed that because they felt that they were competing with this juggernaut the World Wrestling Federation, obviously, and the AWA had to get away from the small studio format in their mind. So they did. And this picture, that skinny guy there with that horrific looking mustache or whatever that is on his lip, that dead caterpillar, that is from August 1st of 1987. And that is at the Minneapolis Auditorium. I was just one of the announced team that worked in Las Vegas. Maybe we got a couple of pictures more for those who were not around or haven't seen AWA Championship Wrestling on the YouTube, as the kids say, on the YouTube. We might have a couple of more pictures. There's Mike Shields, and Joe, your good friend, production extraordinaire. He was the man, Mike Shields.
Dear friend, I will say that when I was working under Mike as a 20-year-old wet behind the ears, green as hell kid, I didn't think that he knew as much as he did. I will openly admit that. And I think like anything else, you get a little bit older. I like to think a little bit wiser. And I realized the what's and hows of what Mike taught me about professional wrestling, in particular editing. And the way that we were doing the shows, his line to me was, you got to cut for money. And that made sense because we're doing between 3 and 4 hours of new original programming per week. We had AWA All-Star Wrestling in syndication. We had AWA Superstars also in syndication, albeit in maybe only about 15 to 20 markets. Then we had AWA Championship Wrestling on ESPN. And so Mike taught me to cut for money. And all of that cutting begins when you're doing the run sheets and laying out the TV shows so that you can simplify the process as much as possible. Basically, show open, intro, match 1, interview 1, black. Come back, do a promo for a town, not an interview, but a 30-second Chiron, as we call them.
Yeah. Match,
interview, commercial. Throw in a special look music video. Throw in what's coming up later in the show type of a thing. Very simplistic, very basic, but we made it work. And I guess maybe thankfully that I didn't have all of the bells and whistles that I have at my disposal today. It would have taken me a lot more. The show would have looked a hell of a lot better. But those original graphics, the quantifont that we had, and I mean, we're just brutal. And of course, Uncle Larry.
That I don't know. That appears to have been taken in an AWA studio, although logic would say that might have been taken at Jukebox Saturday Night as well. After Larry went on a little bit of a binge, but what a guy Larry was to work with. And I worked with Larry a couple of times. He came out there, and then I got the phone call from Larry saying, it's all yours. I don't want to do this anymore. But Larry was such a tremendous, tremendous guy.
Fun is the best way that I could explain Larry. And by the way, if I'm quiet today, guys, if you've not been able to hear, picked up whatever the bug that is going around. So I apologize if I'm too quiet, and just overall in general, and including even having to take a look at my face. But that aside, no, Larry, I've said it a million times on this show. I loved Larry. He was fun. And of course, he is the one that gave me the moniker of Polish Joe.
Love Larry Nelson. Just a great, great guy. And of course, the third Midnight Rocker back in the day, as downtown Minneapolis will attest to. We got another picture. There's my buddy Rod Trongard. And I know, Joe, we've talked on this show about the fact that Rod was a radio announcer. That was his niche. And, sometimes behind the microphone, Rod would describe something like he was calling something on radio, not on television, where the fans had the visual and they didn't need Rod to overstate the case. He and the late Lord Blears, of course, did not get along very well. Rod felt that Lord James Blears would kind of overrun him at the announce table and go from color to play-by-play at the drop of a hat. But Rod Trongard, just a straight-laced guy, we'd go to the matches or go to the show, do the taping, and then Rod would have a piece of pie and a cup of coffee at the Showboat cafeteria, and then off to bed. He was not a party guy, but he was a real professional, and I think really underrated.
Yeah, and I understand the issues that Rod and Lord James Blears had. In particular, as you had alluded to, Rod, he kept his radio persona, his radio delivery, and carried that into television. And so Lord James Blears, who also loved to hear himself talk, did his best to get Rod to shut up, and it became an on-air battle that just did not work well, shall we say. It did not work doing play-by-play and color commentary, but we struggled through it. The one other thing about Rod is Rod loved to ski, and he had a year-round tan. I mean, in the middle of January, he would be at the Showboat Hotel. Looks like he just got back from Cancun for the last 6 months. He was that tan. Well, if you don't know, when you ski, even though it's cold and it's in the snow and you're mostly covered up, you ski in the wintertime and it's sunshine, that sun will reflect off the snow and give you a tan. Now, thankfully, I never saw really much beyond here and maybe his hands, but he always had a tan face. I will say that about Rod.
Rod had a weathered look about him, as well, and we won't talk about Rod beyond this. I remember I had him on SNR, and there's we're going to talk about you and Al DeRusha in just a second. Had Rod on SNR, and Rod's one of these guys that had the right out of radio school voice away from the microphone too. And I remember I was interviewing him, and I said, Rod, who was one of the best wrestlers in the AWA? And Rod, all he had to do was answer me. But he said, I would have to say Tito Santana, he was one of the great ones. And I thought, oh, good Lord, Rod, just talk to me. Anyway, let's get back to that photo of you and our good buddy, the late Al DeRusha. You guys were really attached at the hip for so many years.
We were. This, just to clarify, this is not from the Showboat. This is from Al DeRusha's induction into the Minnesota Broadcast Hall of Fame. But Al made the trip out to Vegas later on. He didn't initially, but he went out there for a few times. He and Mike and myself. I wouldn't say we took turns, but it's like whoever wants to direct tonight, okay, it's your task. And sometimes we split it up because we did have 15 matches that we had to produce. So as you can imagine, if you've never directed, that's a lot of talking over a 3-hour time period, or I should say closer to 2.5 hours actually. But no, I see the picture and I smile and I miss my dear friend.
Yeah, one hell of a guy, the innovator of gimmick as part of the English language, Al DeRusha. Joe, everybody sees the glitz and glamour of television, when you see the finished product, but those were long days. Going from the Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport out to Las Vegas and then doing that couple hours of TV. Just describe for the average fan here, what was a typical day like starting with that flight from Minneapolis?
Well, I need to preface it by saying the good part about it, and besides the fact that, hey, going to Vegas and I'm 22 years old. But this was way before the heightened and tightened security at the airport. And so you could have a 9:14 flight on flight 777 from Minneapolis going to Las Vegas. You could get there at 8:45, 9 o'clock, and still be fine. You know, obviously you didn't want to pack baggage at that point. I just did carry-ons, but one of my carry-ons was a box of 6 90-minute 1-inch reels, which each weighed 9 pounds each. So do the math. So I'm carrying 54 pounds of reeled videotape. Then the plus side is that I didn't really have to carry much of my own stuff because we were only in Vegas for 21 hours.
Right.
You know, we would leave at 9:14, and then with the time change, we would land there about 10:14 Vegas time. And then we would leave just after 7 a.m. Vegas time on Sunday. So to give you the Reader's Digest version, we do the flight. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep because somebody would try to gimmick you and do something to you. So
right.
I learned quickly after that first flight not to do that. We get to the hotel, get checked in. And by the way, the Showboat was not on the strip. It was off all by itself. And I actually really did like that. It didn't have the hustle and the bustle. Originally going to Vegas, take my ass to the strip. I want to go to Caesars and all of that. But over the course of time, it's like, leave the strip for the amateurs. But we get to the Showboat, might be checked into the motel, which was directly across the street in front of the Showboat. So as the Showboat Hotel and Casino was on one side, and most of the times we stayed in the hotel. But sometimes we got stuck over in the motel. The boys
Lap of luxury.
Oh, it was a motel. Yeah. Whatever you think it was, that was the motel. But we get there and then get quote unquote settled in, and then run the videotapes to the truck. Sit in the truck for a short while just to go over the run sheets, get ready for a pre-production meeting as needed with Mike Shields. Typically got done maybe by, let's say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 1:30, 2 o'clock. Then, have a little bit of the afternoon to yourself. So I go down and grab some lunch, have a couple of hands of blackjack, get ready and primed, and then about 4 o'clock, we went to the production truck, started getting graphics done, started testing all of the equipment and all of the gear, and got ready for the show, which typically started at 7 p.m. Vegas time. And so we do the show. By the time we unreeled the videotapes off of the 1-inch machines, I'd get out of the Showboat maybe, see if it's ended at 10, I'd get out of there 11-ish, 11:30, go grab another bite to eat for my dinner, and then proceed always no later than midnight, but proceed to sit at the blackjack table, have a free cocktail, maybe play the video poker machines for a while, and stayed up all night drinking, gambling. Sometimes some other activities were involved, and stayed up all night every time that I went to Las Vegas as a young, wet behind the ear 22-year-old production guy.
We'll get into the hierarchy, the boss and the bookers in just a second, but I remember those flights back to Minneapolis the next day. There were two guys that you could tell had stayed up all night. One of them was Paul E. Dangerously, who would get on the airplane with his suit jacket, with the sleeves rolled up. Didn't bother taking the jacket off. He would lay across, a couple of seats in the airplane. He was out. And Kurt Hennig, who had, had a kind of a good time the previous evening, but you knew that Paulie and Kurt had not exactly gone to bed immediately after the Showboat tapings. But it was fun stuff. Moving on, let's talk about the hierarchy and the bookers in those glorious Showboat days. If we can get Chris to...
Yeah, and I'm still going to call him glorious, Mick. I really, 87 to me was the last good year of the AWA. Now, it didn't compare to the early 80s or certainly before it, but it was the beginning of the end because it was the last good year of the AWA.
We talked about the guy that was in charge, and of course, he needed assistance, and one of them was this guy who was a booker at the time. His wrestling days were basically behind him, but what a talent and what a guy, what a laugh. Ray the Crippler Stevens was one of the bookers, which isn't too damn bad if you're talking about a guy with wrestling knowledge, Ray Stevens.
Well, of course, not only Ray, but let's throw up that other picture of the other booker, and you put these two together, and you've got a couple of high school kids with nothing but time on their hands to be able to cause whatever trouble that they can. And we're talking; these guys were in their mid to late 50s. Nope, not Vern. We're talking about, throw up the next one. We're talking about the great Indian chief, the half Choctaw, half Chickasaw Indian, Wahoo McDaniel.
Can you imagine? I mean, think about it. When people talk about their experiences in pro wrestling, how many people can say they worked under a booking crew of Wahoo McDaniel and Ray Stevens? That didn't get any better than that. And, some would say that occasionally maybe their outside the ring activities interfered with some of their booking logic. But nonetheless, it was great working with Wahoo and Ray. And Greg Gagne was also very, very instrumental and very much a part of that booking combination.
Of course, and I mean, not only Greg, Ray, and Wahoo, but now you can throw the picture up of the chief architect. Vern always still had his hand in the bookings. He had final authority, final approvals before anything else. Now, in this picture, to me, it looks like he's a little frustrated at the fate of the AWA, or maybe it's just because he knows that Karch is on this trip.
I was going to mention that. You said Vern had his hand in the booking and everything else. He also had his hand on my Adam's apple. But that's neither here nor there. But, I've said so many times before, Joe, whatever jokes you want to make, it really was an honor to work with Vern Gagne. And, of course, Greg was kind of my go-to guy for instructions for the ring announcing and play-by-play, et cetera, when I went to Vegas. So Greg was already starting to be, that big-time player in the AWA, but between Wahoo and Ray and Vern and Greg, pretty damn good hierarchy working behind the scenes.
Mick, were you ever involved in those production meetings? You, Rod, any of the other announcers?
Rod and I were not going to the production meetings. That was by design.
Bad, by the way.
It wasn't that we didn't want to be there. It was an office decision, and it made sense. They did not want the announcing team to be smartened up to what was going on in the ring. They wanted it to be all spontaneous and a surprise. And as you see it, ladies and gentlemen, we're seeing it. So Rod and I were not involved in the production meetings. I got most of my my deep six on what happened from Paul E. He would come back from those production meetings and he'd say, they don't listen to a fucking thing I say. Be that as it may. No, we didn't get there yet. So it did. Yeah, it made for spontaneity behind the microphone. Rod and I just did not know what was coming up.
So, I mean, I get that approach that they took. However, what I still do not and will not ever understand is why they excluded me from those production meetings. Now, early on, when I'm directing graphics, yeah, I don't need to be there. It's graphics. Who do I see? Here's DJ Peterson. Okay. Doris was the graphics, actual graphics operator. Now is the director for graphics. Doris put up DJ Peterson. But when I did direct some of the matches, even then, I wasn't brought into the production meetings. I'll give you one example. Now, I didn't direct the match, but I did. We grabbed a fifth camera, handheld camera. It was Will Bryan and I. Grabbed the fifth camera to get the De Beers and Snuka angle, where De Beers comes in, pushes Snuka off the top turnbuckle. Snuka lands on the floor, and I believe Rod's words were he's an abattoir.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for Mike Shields telling us which turnbuckle it was going to happen in, we would never have gotten the shot that we needed to get because Vern and Greg would not smarten me up. They, for the entire run, and I'm telling you this factually, from 85 to 91, when the AWA closed their doors, they still kayfabed me. Whether it was on interview days, maybe it was just because that's the way they had always done it. I don't know. But they kayfabed me, and it wasn't until I'll say 2001-ish when we revived the AWA library in the series of pay-per-views, which that way into the cheap plug for the watch-alongs. It's the AWA pay-per-views I produced. We're sitting at a lunch to discuss things, and Vern lets something flip out about, and I can't remember what it was, but kayfabe was finally broke. He looked at me. He goes, I think you know by now. I looked at him and I go, yeah, fucking think. Anyway. So on to what do we got? What do we got next about the Showboat?
Well, I was going to say, kayfabing you and, you knew what you knew. It's like somebody's got your hand in the fire for, 5 years and then, you're being burned. I mean, nobody has to tell you. We're going to go on to some of the talent and we're going to give them a little brief, not bios, but little memories. But Chris, I know you had a question before we came on the air about the general mood in the locker room back then.
Yeah, because I hear you guys talking, about how, heels were here, baby faces were here, and, how everybody had to communicate and, kind of what you guys were going through. But in terms of the talent, like, what was the atmosphere? What was the mood like? And, you talk about the payoffs. Was the talent getting more and more frustrated, or were they just happy to have this national TV exposure? Like, what were you guys feeling from what you were seeing behind the scenes?
I'll let Joe address that in more detail because Joe had more hands-on behind the scenes. What I saw, I was up at ringside most of the time. I wasn't in the back. I would go back during a tape change. But I noticed some tension, and there was some moods, and there was a little bit of friction. I've told the story before how Mike Tolos, one of the enhancement guys, was on the phone with his girlfriend, talking about an angle that they had just taped. And Greg came over and saw Mike Tolos on the phone, slapped the phone out of his hand, and said, "God damn it, kayfabe! Don't you know better than that?" And he slapped Mike Tolos across the face. It was a period of frustration, needless to say, when Vern went off on me. What Bockwinkel said, he's not yelling at you. He's yelling at everybody. He's yelling at the state of the AWA. So that was kind of it. Did the guys like the fact that they were on national television, worldwide TV, ESPN? Sure they did. But there was a sense of tension. There was a sense of that hammer ready to come down all the time.
One, just kind of a follow-up before you get into it, Joe, and maybe you can speak to this as well. At this point, it seemed like the WWF was starting to make their ascent into being the, primary brand across the nation. Did you hear any chatter of that? Was that anything that they were talking about and a possible, hey, I'm going to stay here until I get that opportunity?
So I will state this as plain and simply as I can. By this point, everybody knew that the WWF at that time was where the money was and was where everybody wanted to be. The AWA, for all of its touting as being the major league of professional wrestling, hell, I wouldn't even say, well, maybe AAA in 1987, but it dropped down to AA, single A, and then rookie league ball in the subsequent years. But the talent that came in here, and we'll see some of the roster here as we go through some of the names, a lot of them came here only because of TV. They were trying to use the TV to be able to springboard themselves to get that big gig with the WWF. They came here because they at least knew they were getting a payday because of ESPN Championship Wrestling and whatever the house might draw. They weren't getting paid well and they weren't getting paid a lot, but they were getting a paycheck. Every talent by this point knew what they were doing, and that was using the AWA as the AWA was using them, just to fill in the blanks that were happening within the organization. The Kurt Hennig story that I've laid out before, when I asked Kurt, why the hell are you still here? And this would have been later in 87. I asked Kurt, why are you still here? Why, hasn't Vince come calling for you yet? And he goes, oh yeah, they have, but Vern's given me a guarantee. And at that point was $180,000 a year, signed him to a 1-year deal. He goes, Vern's paying me all of this money. I'm barely working, so I'm saving my body. I get to stay at home, be with my wife, be with my kids, and still work. He goes, when this contract is up, Vern's not going to be able to afford it to do another year or sign another talent. He goes, but what are you going to do? He offered me this money. I'm going to take the opportunity. And so we did. And I will say that all of the other talent were in the same exact boat, except they weren't getting a guarantee of $180,000. Hell, they weren't getting a guarantee of anything more than, if you go into the Showboat, there'd be a plane ticket for you to get your ass to the Showboat for another taping.
And you got to remember, Kurt is on top at this time. He's the AWA champion. He's just turned heel. And Vern didn't want to lose him. But I remember having those conversations with Kurt too. It was obvious he was going. It was just a matter of when. And to Chris's point, did everybody know that the WWF was the thing? You are 3-4 years into the WWF expansion at this point. It was all over. Everybody knew it. And, it was just a matter, like Joe said, let's stick around for the TV. We're going to take a look at some of the guys that came through. You're going to see this roster back in 87 was still pretty damn good. There's Kurt. Cool Kurt Hennig, the AWA heavyweight champion, and one of the shining lights in the, I won't even say, in the dying days of the AWA, because that was a little bit later on. Kurt had already gone, but what a talent this guy was. And when he turned heel and that personality changed, you saw the beginnings of Mr. Perfect.
I've said it before on this podcast. I consider Kurt Hennig to be one of the greatest all-around performers in the history of professional wrestling.
No question.
Whether it was wrestling, doing a promo, doing color commentary, doing a vignette, whatever it was, Kurt did it perfectly.
Let's keep those. Now, there's a couple of guys. That's the Midnight Rockers. Let me emphasize that I don't know their real names. I've heard of them before, and I know they were coming back to the Showboat at a certain point. In all seriousness, Michaels and Jannetty, boy, the AWA was such a springboard for them, Joe.
Like I said, 87, this feud against Rose and Summers was as good as any feud the AWA, in my opinion, had ever put out there. And Sean and Marty were there, but like I mentioned earlier, they were just using the AWA to stay in front of the WWF, namely Vince McMahon, to be able to get that shot. Now, I'm trying to remember if the Rockers had left and come back.
Yes.
By 87. Yes. So they left in 86 and then came back in 87. Well, quite frankly, because they were a couple of, I don't think they would deny this, but they were a couple of young fuck-ups who didn't care about anything other than where they're going to get laid next and where can I get my next batch of drugs and booze. But they came back to the AWA and they did what they set out to do, and that's stay in front of Vince McMahon, and they eventually made it back to the WWF. So that's just a shining example of what I was talking about earlier.
DJ Peterson, David Peterson, what a nice guy and what a talented guy he was. And tragically, some years ago, he was killed in a motorcycle accident, I believe in the Kansas City area. But DJ Peterson was getting some main event push back then. He was into the mix. He was a great talent. Nothing really flashy about DJ Peterson, but he was a great wrestler, great technical wrestler, had a lot of charisma, and he was a big time player for the AWA.
I loved his promos because he just came across as an average Joe. He wasn't a gimmick. He wasn't a character. He just came across as DJ Peterson, and I really enjoyed working with him. And when you said he died in that motorcycle accident, I remember getting a call from Mercy DeRusha telling me that he got killed in a motorcycle accident. And hey, tomorrow's not guaranteed to any of us. Just a reminder.
Yeah, and DJ was involved in that angle where he won the services of Medusa Michelli as his personal attendant valet for 30 days. Personally, I wouldn't last 30 seconds if Medusa was my valet, but it was an angle that they played off very, very well. And yeah, DJ, we miss you, buddy. Going on, do some more of the talent. There's a guy, and again, tragic ending. Jammin' Mitch Snow. Not the flashiest wrestler in the world, but again, just a solid babyface, good-looking kid. Never really got the main event push, but he was a solid mid-card guy, made a lot of appearances at the Showboat, and very sadly, we hate to say it again, but years later, Jammin' Mitch took his own life. Don't know the circumstances behind that, but here's what's interesting. When Mitch Snow, and I got to double check this, when Mitch Snow came to the AWA and Pat Tanaka came to the AWA, I believe they teamed the two of them up at a Showboat taping. Nobody knew who Pat Tanaka was at the time, so Pat went in as a babyface. There he is right there, prior to his days teaming up with Paul Diamond. So very, very interesting. And Pat Tanaka, another great and very, very underrated talent, a great ring general.
Still owes me $20 from Las Vegas, but that's a whole nother story. For those that know,
luck.
Yeah, I've written that off a long time ago. But For those that know Pat, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, the Wildfire, Tommy Rich.
Tommy Rich's best days, of course, were behind him in Georgia Championship Wrestling. He made a splash later on as a heel for ECW and so forth. But Tommy Rich came into the AWA with a lot of fanfare, and he was immediately pushed into the main event programs with Adrian Adonis. They did an angle on television where Adrian attacked Tommy Rich. I believe he put a dress on him and put lipstick on Tommy Rich. And of course, when Tommy was making the circuit in those Chicago street fight battle royals, the guy would gush like Old Faithful time and time again. And there's Adrian and Paul E. Adrian is not exactly a model for GQ at this point.
Pardon me. You caught me half laughing and half coughing in between. And of course, Nick, I got to throw in there the whole Tommy Rich and Adrian Adonis angle. I believe your favorite special look that I did was a street fight battle royal free for all. Was the music piece that was used. That Tommy Wildfire Rich won. But like you said, he drew a lot of color in that match. Tommy,
oh my God.
Tommy liked the color.
Everywhere they went around the horn. And I got to say, too, about Adrian Adonis. Adrian came into the AWA, having been out, of course, out in WWF territory, doing the flower shop and so on and so forth. Came back in at about 400 pounds. He did not look good. It was more the Adrian Adonis tough guy from the early days, and it kind of dropped the flower shop gimmick. But what's sad is that Adrian, then he went to Japan after he left the AWA, lost a lot of weight. He was getting in tremendous physical condition, ready to start a fresh run in the AWA or elsewhere. And again, the tragedies, Adrian was killed in a van accident up in Canada, I believe, in 1988. So, but a terrific talent. He'd slowed down considerably, but with Paul E in his corner, he's still got incredible heat in the AWA.
I look at that picture and I see Paul E with that cordless phone, and remember giving him shit when he's in an arena, in a venue with the phone. It's like, now keep in mind, this is 1987. Cell phones weren't a thing yet. So I'm going, Paul, so what kind of reception on there? Can you order us a pizza? He would just look at me and go, Polish Joe, you know better than that. Well, if I know better than that, then I think the audience at home does too, Paul.
Greatest thing Paul ever did with that phone of his was hit Jason Hervey over the head down in the WCW territory. And you could hear that clank all the way up to Minnesota. And I really appreciate Paul for doing that. But again, Adonis, red hot heat. There's a guy that we know very well here in the state of Minnesota. Vince McMahon knows him very well when his time came to go to New York. That is Kevin Wackholtz, a.k.a. Mr. Magnificent Kevin Kelly. Here in the AWA, he teamed up with Slick Nick Kaniski, managed by Medusa Michelli, and of course went to the WWF as Nails. And I believe he had a bit of a contract dispute with Vince McMahon at some point or other. Am I correct there, Joe?
He is. Kevin, the best way to put it. Let's just say that he had contract disputes no matter where he went, and that includes the AWA. But when you only have a pie tin without a pie in it, you can't be given a piece of the pie, Kevin.
That's a very astute comment, Joe, and I don't know if we could fit that on a T-shirt, but nonetheless, and Kevin Kelly, Mr. Magnificent, a legit tough guy, a former Tough Man competition winner here in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Would you say he was tough as nails?
You did.
You would. I wouldn't.
Yeah. And Kevin has just recently kind of resurfaced on the on the convention circuit, the Fan Fest circuit. He's making a lot of money. There's another guy. We talked about him before. Wrong place, right time, maybe, or right place, wrong time for Dick Slater. Major talent in the 1970s into the 80s, but in the southern part of the United States. When the AWA was throwing things at the wall to see what would stick, Joe, they brought in Dick Slater. He was more or less mentored storyline by Kurt Hennig. He was not here for more than a cup of coffee, but again, a legit tough guy in this business.
I had said earlier about how the AWA, or how 1987 to me was still a good year, still had a nice run, great talent roster, and so forth. But I'll comment on what you had said about what they could stick against the wall. Dick Slater was one of them. Unfortunately, the noodle wasn't cooked, and so you throw it against the wall and it would just break and fall. And that's at no fault of Dick Slater. That unfortunately just was the case of the AWA. As decent, or dare I say good, the AWA still was in 87. AWA, WWF.
Yeah.
It's just a sad reality by that point.
No question about it. Let's move ahead and look at some of the other talent that frequented AWA rings at the Showboat in 1987. Talk about a guy, I don't even think this was a half a cup of coffee. The nature boy, Buddy Landell. They brought Buddy in. And again, this is a Southern-based wrestler for many, many years and a terrific talent. If you watch some of the Buddy Landell tapes that are out there on YouTube, this guy was really good. He had his own baggage that he dealt with, unfortunately. But, another nationally known star comes into the AWA. And I don't think Buddy Landell made, I hate to say it, any impact whatsoever. He was in and out so fast.
Yeah, when you do one or two shots, it's tough to get yourself established with a fan base. And that's at any period of time that we're talking about. It was very, very rare that a guy would come in and light up the world with his very first match. It happened, but not very often. Buddy Landell wasn't here long enough. And again, when you're walking through a marshy swamp of the AWA at the time, you're going to get some carpet dirty when you walk. And Buddy is one of those that just sort of got lost in the shuffle with a lot of these other guys during that time.
Yeah, and it was interesting because, again, you're talking August of 87, and there was this influx of talent, nationally known talent that were in and out real quickly. This guy was a mainstay in the AWA for so many years, and he was still wrestling on ESPN. Had a television match, I remember, with Greg Gagne. I believe it might have been for the international TV title or in a tournament to determine who was going to the finals of that tournament. Steve Olszanowski, our favorite insurance guy / ninja / wrestler. Steve-O, I believe I introduced him at the Showboat from Edina, Minnesota, the Polish Prince, Steve Olszanowski. Great talent, is still a great guy. Steve was in that mix in 1987 Showboat.
When he came in as Ninja Go, that was sort of a good chuckle, shall we say. But yeah, Steve had a nice career. Never really got to the main event status, maybe a match or two here, but a good hand and a really good mid-card talent and reliable for the AWA.
Very reliable, loved to work. And this guy was still around. Back then, I didn't get a chance to introduce him more than a couple of times, but still an honor. Jerry Blackwell was still hanging on here in 1987 AWA. We've said so many times, one of the greatest big men in the history of wrestling.
And this would have been about that time that Jerry and I roomed together. And I came in with the tapes. And Jerry comes walking out of the shower with, I can't say it was a towel wrapped around him because that would have been an extra large beach towel, but he covered up what he needed to and proceeded to sit on the bed and teach me about the business for about the next 10 minutes.
Boy, I was wondering where you were going with that, Joe. When you said he sat on the bed and taught me, I thought, oh, good Lord. He's got a big body, you know. Oh my God. Oh boy.
No, I didn't going into that story, but of course, with your demented and warped mind, that's where you went with it. I would never have thought of that, but no, it was as strange and, dare I say, mildly uncomfortable. It was still a lesson learned by what I consider one of the all-time greats, Jerry Blackwell. So the fact that he took time to do that, I greatly appreciate it.
These two guys here, these pseudo-Soviets, as I call them, that would be Boris Zukov, Jim Harrell, and Soldat Ustinov, Jim Lanning, the Soviet Jims, who teamed up here in the AWA area. Boris and Soldat were two great guys. And, of course, the AWA in 1987, they're still fighting the war. They're still fighting that Cold War with the Soviets. And, these two guys didn't do too badly with the Russian accents. I think they kept their promos to a minimum, so nothing would, seep through of an American accent. But they were great guys. And Zukov, look at the size of that man's head, as Chris Markoff would say, and our good friend Jim Lanning. Dastardly duo in the AWA 1987.
Let's move on to our next one, because I know we're running short on time. Now, this is the guy, our next one that he worked, but he wasn't exactly a seasoned ring veteran. We're talking about JT Southern.
He wasn't an apprentice carpenter either. An apprentice carpenter wouldn't use a body slam or a drop toe holder or whatever it was in the middle of a battle royal, and have Vern Gagne threaten to fire him over the microphone on national television. DJ Peterson, if you're going to put the initial crew together, DJ Peterson was an A+ guy. JT Southern, what do you think, Joe? C- maybe?
Oh God, I'd go somewhere in the D's. I mean, I got along just fine with JT. He was very nice, pleasant, but his in-ring ability and interview skills were just, he wasn't going to make it.
There you go.
I'll leave it at that.
All right. Continuing on. All right, this guy here. That is Billy Jack Strong, a.k.a. Steve DeSalvo, who came into the AWA again the fall of 1987. I remember very well. I think this might have been at Whitewater. At Whitewater, if not the Showboat, where I went up to Steve DeSalvo, Billy Jack Strong, and I said, okay, I need your weight, whatever he said, 285, 300. And I said, and where's your hometown? He said, God, I don't know. Where should I be billed from? I said, how about Tempe, Arizona? He said, fine, Tempe, Arizona. So Steve DeSalvo from Tempe, Arizona, Billy Jack Strong. Our good friend Rick Gantner, one of the Texas hangmen, said that the single worst match he remembered having in the AWA was with Billy Jack Strong. He said the guy wouldn't work a lick. And finally, referee Juice DeRusha said, come on, let Rick carry this match. So let's make something of this. Not the greatest worker in the world, big, strong guy, but again, that cup of coffee at the AWA.
Who had the bigger cup of coffee, he or Rocky Mountain Thunder? I feel I can put them in the same category. Steve was better than Rocky Mountain Thunder, but not by much.
Yes, Steve was not exactly your high flyer. in the ring. He was not a jumping Jim Brunzell. His idea of a drop kick was to scuff his shoes.
Yes.
We're going into the ladies back in the day, and that is my friend Candy Devine, the late Candy Devine. She was a major player. The AWA was starting to showcase the ladies more often in 1987, and Candy had started out as the AWA ladies champion. What a sweetheart of a gal.
Very pleasant to work with. She never caused any issues whatsoever. And as far as I knew, I got along with the next two. In the next picture, we're going to talk about Peggy Lee Leather and Bambi.
Peggy Lee Leather and Bambi, indeed, they worked together. Probably 90% of their career was wrestling each other. Everywhere there was a wrestling card where they featured the women, you would have Peggy Lee Leather and Bambi. My understanding is that they were partners. They were romantically linked. So it was natural, they could get into the ring, have their match, go home and, discuss whatever. Peggy Lee Leather, sadly, again, oh my God, we're talking one after another of these AWA stars that are no longer with us. But they were two of the great talents in the AWA. Sherry Martel had been gone by that point. So Sherry was no longer part of the Showboat AWA situation in 1987.
No, but I would like to, and I've said this before, Sherry Martel started the true women's wrestling run in the AWA. Sherry and then Medusa. Candy had been here before. You throw her in the mix as well, but speaking of Deuce. But they were the... Sherry started it, Medusa carried it. I'll leave it at that.
And we're looking at Medusa there. What a beautiful person she is, both physically and, inside and out. Just a great, great lady. Medusa will be the first to tell you, the AWA run, she was basically coming out of Eddie Sharkey's Pro Wrestling America training camp. She was pretty green. If you look at some of the matches, she was just getting her feet wet in the business, but nonetheless, she was developing that heel personality, and she did extremely well in vaulting the women's wrestling division in the AWA to the next level. No doubt about it.
Yeah, one of my favorites to work with. I'll still never forget when she was gone from the AWA for a short while and came back, and shall we just say she had a couple of enhancements when she came back in.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to go a couple of enhancements and then we go
Jerry Lawler.
Bill Dundee. Jerry Lawler, yes.
No, you didn't want to do that. Lawler and Dundee, the AWA World Tag Team Champions, came in. I believe they had, if I remember correctly, was it Boris Zukov who went to the WWF, and so they had to quick switch the AWA tag team titles, and then Lanning and somebody else lost to the Midnight Express, I believe, or to Lawler and Dundee down in the Memphis territory. Jerry and Bill came up to the AWA area. I remember they were at the Showboat. They did one appearance, but then they had that infamous Whitewater evening where they won the AWA tag team titles from the Midnight Express, the original Midnight Express, Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose, managed by Paul E. Dangerously. Years later, I saw Jerry at Cauliflower Alley, and I said, Jerry, I was the ring announcer that night. And there's Paul E. and the original Midnight Express. I said, Jerry, I was the ring announcer the night you wrestled in Whitewater, Wisconsin. And Jerry says, well, fuck your luck. And I think that pretty much said it all. But this combination, the original Midnight Express, Dennis Condrey, Paul Heyman, and Randy Rose, they were so great and great veterans. And Paul E., a young guy at the time, was their mouthpiece, and they were very, very good as AWA Tag Team Champions.
Consummate pros. They could work inside the ring, and they could do well on the promo. They didn't really need Paulie Dangerously to do the promos, But having said that, I don't know that they could fully carry a 2.5 minute interview by themselves. That'd be good for a minute, maybe, but mixing them in with Paul E dangerously was a great move. And
absolutely. How can you go wrong with Paul E as your mouthpiece?
Exactly, even at that young age. But I'll throw in something about the Lawler and Dundee. So this is 1987 we're talking about, even the Whitewater stuff. It would have been about a year later when Super Clash 3 came about and all of the different organizations joined forces. So I bring that up because you're sort of seeing some of the Memphis boys start to come in because Memphis was struggling as well. So
who wasn't struggling outside of WWF? Everybody was starting to tank, even the NWA at that point. So
very, very true. Now our next guy. We're going straight to the show. What do we got?
We're going to go to this first, and the reason I put this up here, this is the debut night for me in the AWA. This was the card, and Nick and Kurt were on top, and then you see Wahoo McDaniel and DJ Peterson. You see the lineup of guys that we're talking about. That's still a pretty damn good roster. And then I want you to go down to that attendance. Look at that attendance at the Minneapolis Auditorium, August of 1987. Folks, this is a group that was selling out the St. Paul Civic Center consistently. 18, 19,000, 6-7 years prior to that. This is, probably a year and a half after Wrestle Rock. It was that dismal by that point, Joe, in the AWA.
Yeah, hell, it's only just over a year. It's about 15 months after Wrestle Rock. But the thing that struck me as strange, even back then, is you had made this long run at the St. Paul Civic Center, and now all of a sudden you decide to go back to the smaller Minneapolis Auditorium. It felt like the waving of the white flag, or at least starting to tie that white flag onto the stick. Maybe not waving it quite yet, but getting ready to get that stick out in front and say, okay, I've had enough of this shit.
I put this up for a reason. That is the Whitewater event. Of course, it's always good to run a card on Halloween weekend in a college town.
Sure.
That's excellent promoting and planning there. But look how many matches, Joe. 20-some matches on that taping. I didn't remember, for God's sakes, doing that many. But look at what the AWA did. Again, the end of October 1987. Can you imagine? I mean, I guess they do it today with the collision tapings and everything else and people sitting through dark matches. But look at that number of matches in Whitewater.
Now, I just did a quick count, and that would be 28 matches.
Oh, my God.
And now, knowing how the shows were put together, typically for a 1 hour all-star wrestling show, it would be 5 matches. So there were like 6 TV tapings. We only did 3 is what we had counted on back in the day. 3 episodes, and then we go back in and get 3 more. So we would have done 6 tapings, 6 show tapings, I should say, in Whitewater, where it looked like shit, where the crowd was the shits. And I guarantee you that the talent wasn't exactly happy about having to sit in the locker room for 28 fucking matches.
28 matches, of which probably 5 made the air. That's kind of the worst part about it. And how the hell did I get in and out of the ring 28 times? My God, I couldn't even pull myself up to the, bottom rope strand today. Good Lord. All right. So there's your look back, folks, at 1987 AWA. Larry Zbyszko, of course, was a key player back in 87. No question about it. There he is. There's the Kingfish, Larry Zbyszko. Larry has actually fallen asleep here while he was, stalling for the picture to be taken. So Larry is, kind of at half-mast. But again, early on, he was not champion yet, but you saw the beginnings of the Larry Zbyszko era in the AWA.
Cheese pizza. That's what I think of. Stalling and cheese pizza, the two things that come to mind when I see Larry Zbyszko.
Looking back on the, first of all, I can't believe that it's almost 38 years. That is just mind blowing to me. And it's great in the one sense, Joe, that, you know, we experienced it. We were there. We were in Vegas. The AWA was on worldwide television, but it's sad at the same time because you could see what was coming around the corner.
It's sadly, yeah. I mean, despite the successes of some of the house shows in particular, again, I'll bring up the Rockers versus Rose and Summers. You throw in Nick Bockwinkel and Kurt Hennig. That 1 hour Broadway. The talent was still there. The work was still there. The matches were still there. The fans had already left the building. There was no resurrecting the glory heydays of the AWA. In hindsight, I think Vern, and this is purely speculation, in hindsight, I firmly believe that if Vern could go back in time, he would have pulled the plug in 1987.
Probably would have saved himself a lot of headaches. No question about it. It's it's too bad. But again, you know, we can't ignore the final years of the AWA. It's part of their 30-year history. We can't just focus on the good times. It's all part of it.
Hey, by the way, for me, 87 were still good times.
I totally agree. Absolutely.
I've been there for 2 years. I'm still learning the business and learning my craft, you know, the behind the scenes stuff. So I was still having a great time and I still enjoyed it. And Vern in the office, they kept things close to the vest as to how things were going. But anybody with any type of sense knew things weren't good in the office.
Yeah, and for me, again, you know, I was a kid. I was in 7th grade. So to me, any wrestling at that point, and knowing that it was out of Minneapolis, but again, it's Vegas, it's Showboat, to me, it felt big. So even if it wasn't as big as it once was, I think that's kudos to you guys, Mick doing your job, Joe doing your job, is you made it feel bigger than what it was to a 7th grader, you know, from southwestern Minnesota. So I appreciate that because you guys helped enhance my enjoyment of, you know, when I was just beginning my fandom as a wrestling fan.
We appreciate that very, very much. And and as I've said, I kid about the situation with Vern. Vern Gagne was my boyhood idol. And, you know, here I am working for him, and I will forever be grateful to Vern and Greg and the whole organization. So, speaking of legends, before we go to our shout out, we got to mention somebody. We're a little delayed here on this announcement, but there he is, Eddie Sharkey, all 89 years young. Of Eddie Sharkey. Eddie celebrated a birthday not that long ago. One of the funniest guys, one of the boys. If there ever was a promoter or whatever you want to call Eddie, that was one of the boys, it's him. So God bless Eddie Sharkey. He's still out there alive and kicking. Always great to see him. 89 years old, Eddie Sharkey.
Happy belated 89th, Eddie. And well, Mick, when are you? You're 89 next year, right?
Year after.
Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure we get that on the podcast.
You prick.
Yes, I am.
All right, let's.
God.
Oh,
Clock is moving fast enough. Jesus. God.
That would have been a perfect ending. Unfortunately, we got to do the shout out and one more plug on the end. But
don't say unfortunately we got to do the shout out.
Oh, I didn't. Okay.
It's fortunate we're doing a shout out. My shout out is to a guy that we're going to have on this show very, very soon. And that is my buddy, Chief Jules Strongbow, out there on the East Coast, I believe, unless he moved back to Milwaukee or whatever. Love Chief Jules, a.k.a. Frankie Hill. He wants to be on the show, and damn it, we're going to get him on the show.
Love it. My shout out goes, and I got to admit this. Had Mick pick one up for me. Again, I am feeling under the weather. Just didn't have, and no smart ass comments on this, but I didn't have the mental faculties to even pick a name for my shout out. So I'm going to thank Mick and Chris for giving me the shout out, and it goes to Jim Pouquet.
Oh, Jimbo.
Yeah, I actually have to hold on. I need to redo that. Hold on.
Wait a minute. Whenever Tubbs has to redo something, you never know what's going to happen. Yeah, Joe, no, your faculties were all in order there, Joe. We didn't notice any difference whatsoever.
Yeah, because Jim likes to text or email in all caps.
All caps, absolutely.
Yeah, and Jim, I like you, man. You're good. You're good people. But you like to text in all caps. Look, he's yelling at us. And Bill Klein, who was over in Qatar, or is it Qatar? I can never get it right. Working those 12-hour days, watches our podcast on the weekends. Hey, we appreciate all that you're doing, and looking forward to you retiring in just a few years. So, Bill, thank you for being a longtime supporter of the podcast. And reminder, everybody, if you want to be an extra supporter of our podcast, join our Pinfall. It is $4.99 a month. You get the podcast a day early. You get our watch-alongs. You get our live chats. You get a 5-pack picture from Mick. You get a letter and a magnet sticker, everything from us, and just a fun way to support us, as well with tpublic.com, where you can get all sorts of fun AWA Unleashed merchandise. So there we go, guys. I appreciate you guys battling, especially you, Joe. I know you feel like dog shit, but I appreciate that you stuck it out, because when you have to do something like this and you feel like shit, it is not fun.
You know, and this is an honest answer. This is not fluff or whatever, but we have, unfortunately, for the last couple of months, to our loyal listeners, we have dropped the ball between the holidays, my mom passing, Chris having some issues, and so forth. I didn't have the heart to delay yet another week, and I'm sick of it. I want to get caught back up. We owe you guys a watch along. We're just gonna. I don't know that we're going to go back and make up for January and December, but we're going to pick up, start doing them again, get back on track, and illness or not, I actually feel better than I sound, but at the same time, I still feel like shit.
Well, Joe, that was a wonderful speech, a heartfelt speech, but I know Chris Tubbs, and you are going to get zero increase in your salary. Despite your testimonial there,
I dispute that. I think I'm expecting I'm expecting as big of a bump in pay for this podcast as Vern gave you, the ring announcer for the AWA.
Oh fuck!
That's my contract demand. I'm holding you to it.